Part 1. The Academy Years. Chapter 1. The Ghost Arrives. The first time Damien Blackwood saw her, she was standing in the great hall of the Silverwood Academy, a solitary island in a sea of chattering nobles and pedigreed purebloods. She was a whisper in a room built for proclamations. The King's scholarship recipients were always announced with fanfare, their histories vetted, their allegiances sworn. But her name, Kira Vance, had appeared on the lists without preface. A half-blood, they murmured, unregistered, no clan, no sire, no history. A ghost. Damien, then in his final year, watched her from the heir's dais, his suspicion a cold, coiling thing in his gut. His family had survived a coup attempt only a decade prior, instigated by a network of unregistered half-bloods who had infiltrated the highest levels of the court. They had learned the hard way that what you couldn't see could kill you. She was thin, with the kind of sharp-boned fragility that spoke of a long acquaintance with hunger. Her clothes were threadbare but clean, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. But it was her eyes that held him, a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter storm over the sea. Kira Vance was invisible. She moved through the Academy's marble halls with a preternatural quietness, her eyes always downcast, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She seemed to take up as little space as possible, a wraith of gray wool and silence. But her magic was a roar. In the training sales, where others wrestled with complex elemental matrices, she wove threads of pure energy with an instinctual grace that defied her lack of formal training. She was a prodigy, a weapon of unknown origin, and her silence was, to Damien, the most damning evidence of all. He had been 15 when the rebellion came. His uncle Varen had led it, using unregistered half-bloods as his spies and assassins. The woman who was his mother's closest handmaiden, who taught him how to read, had tried to poison his mother. His personal guard, a man he'd idolized since childhood, had opened the gate for Varen's soldiers. He could still remember the screams, the smell of fire, the sight of his father's guards cutting down men and women he had known his entire life. They had put down the rebellion. Varen was executed. But the fear never went away. His father became obsessed with security, and Damien learned that trust was a liability, that anyone could be a traitor, that the people who seemed the most harmless were often the most dangerous. When Kira Vance arrived at the Academy, a ghost with no history, no family, a scholarship that appeared out of nowhere, she was the exact image of the threat he'd been trained his whole life to see. He approached her once, in the library, under the guise of a senior student offering mentorship. He'd cornered her between shelves of ancient grimoires, the air thick with the scent of dust and decaying paper. "Kira Vance," he'd said, his voice deliberately low and resonant, the way he'd been taught to command attention. "You're making quite a name for yourself." She didn't look up from the book in her hands. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate skin of her throat, a frantic little bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her only response was to pull her threadbare cloak tighter around herself. Her stillness was an insult. It was a wall he couldn't breach, and it infuriated him. "The King's scholarship is a great honor," he pressed, stepping closer, deliberately invading her space. "It requires a certain transparency, a history. You don't seem to have one." For the first time, she lifted her head. Those gray eyes met his, and they were not frightened as he'd expected. They were weary, ancient. They held him in their gaze for a long, silent moment, and in them he saw not a spy, but a survivor. It was a fleeting impression, one his paranoia quickly crushed. "I'm here to study," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "That's my history." She slid past him then, a wraith of gray and silence, leaving him standing alone in the aisle, the scent of rain and something wild, like crushed herbs, lingering in the air. That was the day he declared war. He reported her to his father, citing his suspicions. The king, ever the diplomat, demanded proof. "Suspicion is not a death sentence, Damien. Bring me facts, not feelings." So Damien resolved to find the proof himself. He investigated obsessively, hired informants, traced records, pursued every lead. Every investigation confirmed the magistrate's documentation. Corvus Vance had registered her as his bastard daughter. The paperwork was flawless. But every dead end felt deliberately obscured. The magistrate had been part of the original investigation into Varen's coup. His credentials were beyond reproach. To Damien, this only made it worse. The perfect documentation, the impeccable history. It was too perfect, too clean. He didn't know that the magistrate was hiding something, just not what Damien thought. So Damien decided to manufacture the proof himself. He would apply pressure until she broke. He would torment her until she confessed. He would make her scream her secrets to the entire academy, and he would be vindicated. It was a righteous crusade. He was protecting his family, his kingdom. He was sure of it. Chapter 2: The Isolation. In their second year at the academy, he focused on isolating her. He used his influence, his status as the heir, to turn her into a pariah. He spread whispers that she was unstable, that her magic was uncontrolled, that she stole from other students. Lies, all of them, but lies were a currency he spent freely. He was careful, operating within plausible deniability. He never bullied her directly. He created systems where others did it for him. Students who had once offered her a tentative smile now crossed the corridor to avoid her. Study groups she tried to join would dissolve into awkward silence upon her arrival. Teachers, influenced by his subtle poison, began to scrutinize her work with suspicion, looking for plagiarism, for cheating, for any sign of the duplicity he assured them was there. Professor Alara Sterling, a stern but fair pureblood, had noticed. She'd tried to protect Kira in small ways: extra office hours, gentle encouragement, pointed questions in faculty meetings about the treatment of scholarship students. Damien had been too arrogant to see it then. Years later, she would testify about what she'd witnessed. Her words would be another stone in the cairn of his shame. Chapter 3: The Warding Exam. With dark satisfaction turning to tension, he remembered one incident with a clarity that would burn him like a brand for the rest of his life. There was a mandatory collaborative project in advanced warding theory in their third year. Students were to pair up to construct a multi-layered defensive shield capable of repelling a Tier 4 energy assault. It was the final exam, worth half their grade. No one would partner with Kira. She was left alone, the last student standing as the others formed their pairs. Professor Sterling had looked at her with pity. "You may complete the project alone, Miss Vance," she'd said, her voice echoing in the suddenly silent amphitheater. "You will be graded on the same scale, however. I suggest you begin immediately." Damien had watched from his seat, a cold knot of satisfaction in his chest. This was it. This would be the test she couldn't pass. A Tier 4 ward was nearly impossible for a single caster to erect and maintain. She would fail. She would be exposed as a fraud, her vaunted talent not enough to overcome the obstacle he had built for her. He expected her to protest, to weep, to finally break. Instead, she had simply nodded, gathered her materials, and walked to the most remote casting circle in the chamber. For the next 3 weeks, she was a ghost in the Academy's library and a titan in the training salle. She barely ate, her already thin frame becoming gaunt. He would see her at all hours, poring over ancient texts, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle, her expression one of fierce, desperate concentration. Other students whispered that she was going mad. Damien told them she was growing desperate, that her cover was about to be blown. On the day of the exam, she looked like a wraith. Her uniform hung off her, and her gray eyes were sunk deep into shadowed sockets, but they burned with a feverish light. One by one, the pairs presented their wards. Most held for a few seconds against the energy beam before shattering. Damien and his partner, a brawny pureblood named Thane, managed to hold theirs for a full minute, a new academy record. He had smirked at Kira as he returned to his seat. "Your turn, little spy." She walked to the center of the chamber. She didn't use any of the standard focusing crystals or runic arrays. She simply closed her eyes, her hands held loosely at her sides. The air around her grew still, heavy. She began to weave. It wasn't the rigid academic casting they had been taught. It was something older, wilder. She drew energy not just from her own core, but from the very stone of the castle, from the air, from the sliver of moonlight visible through the high-arched window. Light coalesced around her, not in a single, solid shield, but in dozens of shimmering, overlapping layers, like the petals of a luminous rose or the scales of a celestial dragon. Each layer moved independently, shifting and flowing, absorbing and redirecting the energy that struck it. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was impossible. Professor Sterling activated the energy cannon. The beam of raw power, crackling and white-hot, slammed into Kira's ward. The outer layer flared and dissolved, but the one beneath it held, and the one beneath that. The ward buckled and groaned, but it did not break. Kira's body shook with the strain, a fine trickle of blood leaking from her nose. But her eyes remained closed, her concentration absolute. 1 minute passed. The new record. 2 minutes. The chamber was utterly silent, the only sound the hum of the cannon and Kira's ragged breaths. 3 minutes. Professor Sterling, her face pale with shock, shut down the cannon. The ward dissolved into a shower of fading motes, leaving Kira standing alone in the circle, swaying with exhaustion. She had not only passed, she had redefined what was possible. She had proven him wrong. And Damien had hated her for it more than ever. Her genius was just another part of her lie, a more elaborate deception. The Academy launched a formal investigation into her abilities. Where had she learned such ancient techniques? The investigation found nothing, because the magistrate's documentation was flawless. But to Damien, it was more proof of the conspiracy. Doubt had begun to creep in. What if he was wrong? But he crushed it with renewed cruelty. He had to break her. He could not stand to be wrong. Chapter 4. The Winter Gala. The breaking point came at the Winter Gala in their 3rd year. It was the Academy's most prestigious event, a night where the ancient vampire houses displayed their wealth and power, and their heirs forged alliances. Attendance was mandatory. Damien knew Kira had no gown, no money, no allies. He knew she would be utterly alone and out of place. He'd arranged it all with a sociopath's precision. He bribed the dormitory mistress to lose the plain, serviceable dress the Academy provided for scholarship students. He made sure her name was at the top of the list for the ceremonial procession into the ballroom, guaranteeing she would be the first person everyone saw. He wanted to see her humiliated, to watch her spirit finally crumble under the weight of public shame. He envisioned her either failing to appear, earning a severe reprimand, or showing up in her worn daily uniform, a walking symbol of her otherness. He stood near the grand entrance with his coterie, a smug, expectant smile on his face. The trumpets sounded, the great oak doors swung open, and Kira Vance walked in. She wasn't wearing a gown of silk or velvet. She wore a simple dress of dark gray wool, the same one she wore to class every day. But she had transformed it. She had painstakingly embroidered the hem and cuffs with silver thread in complex, swirling patterns that seemed to catch and hold the light. They were ancient protection runes, woven with such skill that they seemed to shimmer with their own inner power. Her dark hair, usually tied back in a severe knot, was loose, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore no jewelry, no makeup. She was stark and simple. And she was the most breathtakingly beautiful person in the room. A hush fell over the assembled nobles. They were looking at a work of art, a display of raw talent and defiant grace that eclipsed all their gaudy finery. She walked with her head held high, her gray eyes sweeping over the crowd with that same unnerving calm. She didn't look at Damien, but he felt her gaze pass over him, an acknowledgement of his pathetic little plot and her complete and utter triumph over it. She had not only refused to be broken, she had taken his weapon and reforged it into a crown. He felt a surge of fury so potent it made him dizzy. It was mingled with something else, something he refused to name, a grudging, infuriating flicker of admiration. Later that night, he found her alone in the gardens, seeking refuge from the stifling ballroom. The air was cold, smelling of frost and damp earth. She was standing by a frozen fountain, her breath pluming in the moonlight. This was his chance. No audience, no pretense, just him and her and the crushing weight of his frustration. "That was quite a performance," he said, his voice dripping with venom. She turned slowly. "I was told attendance was mandatory." "You enjoy this, don't you?" he snarled, stalking toward her. "This game, the silent martyr, the misunderstood genius. You think you're better than all of us." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just want to be left alone." "You are a spy," he hissed, grabbing her arm. Her bones felt as fragile as a bird's beneath his fingers. He expected her to flinch, to cry out. She did neither. She simply went completely still, the freeze response of someone who had learned that fighting back only made it worse. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. And her expression was not one of fear, but of pity. A deep, profound pity that enraged him more than any defiance. "You see enemies everywhere," she whispered, "even in someone who just wants to survive." And then the rage drained out of him, replaced by a confusion so profound it felt like vertigo. He shoved her away from him, hard. She stumbled back, catching herself on the lip of the frozen fountain. The pity in her eyes was gone, replaced by that familiar, weary resignation. He had proven her right, whatever she had been thinking. "Stay away from me," he growled, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and a confusion he couldn't stand. He turned and stormed back toward the light and noise of the ballroom, leaving her alone in the cold, silent dark. He did not see her wrap her arms around herself, a tremor finally running through her body. He did not see the single tear that traced a path down her cheek before freezing in the winter air. He saw only his own righteous anger and used it to blind himself. Chapter 5. The Final Year. Their final year passed in bitter stalemate. Damien's crusade had reached its limits. He had isolated her completely, turned her into a ghost in a school full of people. She spoke to no one. She ate alone. She studied alone. She existed in a bubble of profound, impenetrable solitude. And yet she excelled. Every exam, every project, every demonstration of skill, she surpassed them all. Her grades were flawless. Her magic was unmatched. She was graduating with the highest honors the Academy had ever awarded. He had failed. 4 years of torment, and he had no confession, no proof, no victory. Just a woman who had survived him and would walk away with her secrets intact. But what Damien didn't know was that Kira had been fighting a war on 2 fronts. Throughout her time at the Academy, she had been feeding information to the magistrate. Small things, useless things. Damien's class schedule, what he ate for breakfast, which professors he liked. Things any servant could have known, passed through dead drops and coded letters. The magistrate grew increasingly frustrated. He wanted real intelligence, treason, conspiracy. And in her final year, he gave her an ultimatum. Poison the prince, or he would find her sister Lyra, alive, suffering in a workhouse he controlled, and make her pay for Kira's disobedience. Kira refused. She would face Damien's hatred. She would endure his cruelty. but she would not become a murderer. So she made a plan. She would graduate, she would take her diploma, and she would disappear into a city large enough to swallow her whole, where neither the magistrate nor the prince could ever find her. Graduation day arrived. The ceremony was held in the great hall where she had first appeared 4 years prior. The assembled nobles and their heirs watched as names were called, as students crossed the stage to receive their diplomas and the king's blessing. When Kira's name was called, the hall fell silent. She walked across that stage with the same quiet grace she had always carried, her gray eyes straight ahead, seeing nothing and no one. Damien watched from the heir's dais. He expected to feel triumph, vindication. She was leaving, and good riddance. But instead he felt empty, hollow, as if 4 years of certainty had been building towards something that never came. She took her diploma from the king's hands. King Alaric looked at her for a long moment, and Damien saw something in his father's face he couldn't identify. Sadness, perhaps, or recognition. Kira bowed, turned, and walked off the stage. She walked through the great oak doors of the academy, and she vanished. The next morning, when Damien went to find her, to make one last attempt at breaking her silence, he found her dormitory room empty, stripped bare, no possessions, no forwarding address, no trace that she had ever been there at all. Except for a loose floorboard beneath her cot. Part 2. The Discovery. Chapter 6. The Letters. He found them by accident. He was searching for proof, for anything she might have left behind. His fingers caught on the edge of the loose board, and when he pried it up, there was a small space beneath. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written on cheap paper in a hand that trembled just enough to blur the ink. They were addressed to someone named Lyra. I write to you because I cannot speak your name aloud. To speak it is to remember your face in the moments before they took you, and I cannot bear that memory. He read them all, every single one. He knelt on that dusty floor as the sun moved across the sky, as shadows lengthened and the academy grew quiet around him. He learned that Kira and Lyra had been found together, 2 half-blood orphans hiding in the ruins of a village. Corvus Vance, then a junior magistrate, had been overseeing the census. He saw Kira's nascent magical talent and registered her as his own bastard, a secret to be kept and cultivated. Lyra, who had no magic, was deemed useless. She was sold to a workhouse. Kira never saw her again. She didn't even know if her sister was alive. He keeps me in the basement. He says the dark will help my power grow. I think the dark just helps him forget I am here. He brings food sometimes. Sometimes he forgets. The hunger is a hollow ache, but the cold is worse. It gets into your bones. I try to weave little threads of warmth from the energy in the stone, but I am not strong enough yet. Her chronicle of abuse was written in a stark, factual tone that made it all the more horrifying. There was no self-pity, only observation. The beatings were lessons in discipline. The starvation was a way to purify the body for magic. The isolation was a necessary precaution. She documented it all for a sister she thought was dead, the only witness she would ever have. And then there was the part about the academy. I have received a scholarship. The magistrate arranged it. He says it is time for me to be useful. He wants me to watch the royal family. He wants me to report on the prince. He says if I do not, he will fine Lyra and make her suffer for my disobedience. I do not know if he is lying. I cannot take the chance. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been a spy. She had been a slave, a child blackmailed with the threat of her sister's torture. Her silence had not been guilt. It had been a shield against the magistrate's demands and a shield against him. She had been trapped between 2 monsters and had chosen to face the one who only tormented her spirit, not the one who owned her soul. He kept reading. She wrote about classes, about the other students, about the impossible beauty of the Academy's libraries. And then she wrote about him. There were several entries about his campaign of cruelty. Each one was brief, factual, devoid of emotion. She documented his actions the way she documented the magistrate's beatings, as simply another trial to endure. And then he found the entry about the warding exam, the public triumph he had intended as a humiliation. Today, the prince tried to have me expelled. He ensured I had no partner for the final warding exam. I think he expected me to fail. I did not. I showed them what I can do. He looked so angry. His cruelty cannot starve me. The Academy feeds me. For the first time in my life, I sleep in a warm bed. His hatred is a price I can pay for this. His years of systematic psychological torture, the apex of his cunning and cruelty, were a relief to her, a step up from the quiet, suffocating horror of her childhood. He had thought himself a master of pain, a righteous inquisitor breaking a dangerous enemy. He was nothing more than a schoolyard bully, a pale imitation of a true monster. The magistrate had kept her weak, hungry, cold, isolated. The Academy, despite Damien, had given her food, warmth, education, a place to sleep. For the first time in her life, she had resources. She had a chance. His torment was terrible, but it hadn't destroyed her, because she was finally strong enough to survive it. He wasn't the monster of her story. He was a footnote, a manageable obstacle in a life full of true horrors. The sun had set. The room was dark. Damien sat on the floor surrounded by letters written in a shaking hand, and understood that the only villain in this story was him. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. He went to his father that night. He walked through the castle's corridors like a ghost, the letters clutched in his hands. He didn't knock on the door to the king's study. He simply walked in. King Alaric Blackwood looked up from his desk, took one look at his son's face, and dismissed his advisors with a gesture. When they were alone, Damien placed the letters on the desk. "I was wrong," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow. "About Kira Vance. I was wrong about everything." His father picked up the first letter, then the second. He read them all in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. When King Alaric finally spoke, his voice was cold enough to frost the windows. "You tortured an innocent girl for 4 years based on suspicion and paranoia." "Yes." "You used your position, your influence, your name, everything I gave you, to systematically destroy a scholarship student who had committed no crime." "Yes." The king stood. He walked to the window and stared out at the kingdom for what felt like an eternity. When he turned back, his face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "You will find her," he said. "You will make this right. And you will do it as a prince of this house, because if you fail, you will have proven you are unworthy of the title." He paused. "Do not fail me again, Damien." It wasn't exile. It was something worse. A chance to fail publicly, completely, with the full weight of the crown watching. "The magistrate," Damien said. "Corvus Vance. He's still out there, still—" "I will deal with the magistrate," his father said. "You focus on finding the girl you destroyed. And Damien?" He looked his son in the eye. "I am ashamed of you. Deeply, profoundly ashamed. You will carry that knowledge with you until you have earned the right to stand in my presence again without flinching." Damien bowed. He left the study. Behind him, his father began to draft orders to the crown's investigators. The court would know. Everyone would know. The whispers began immediately. The prince who tortured an innocent. The heir who saw conspiracies in shadows. Damien barely heard them. He had already begun to search. Chapter 8. The Search. With exhaustion building over time, the search took 3 years. 3 years of his father's quiet disappointment, of the court's whispering judgment. Damien dismantled his life to find hers. He poured the Blackwood fortune into a network of informants, tracing whispers of a dark-haired healer with quiet hands and eyes that saw too much. He followed false leads from the frozen north to the southern sea, each dead end a fresh lash of his own guilt. He grew thin. The certainty that had defined him curdled into a hollow, aching obsession. Meanwhile, the Crown's investigation into Corvus Vance was swift and brutal. The magistrate had been careful, but not careful enough. Damien's father unleashed the full investigative power of the throne, and within months they had uncovered a lifetime of corruption. Unregistered children bought and sold, forgeries, blackmail, and a workhouse outside the capital where a young woman named Lyra had been suffering for 15 years. The evidence was irrefutable. The magistrate, facing public disgrace and eternal imprisonment, took his own life in his opulent study. Lyra was freed. The king himself sent emissaries to bring her to the capital, to offer her reparations, safety, a new life. But Kira didn't know any of this. She had vanished too completely. And then, 2 years and 11 months into the search, a breakthrough. A name spoken by a grateful mother in a back alley clinic in a city that thrived on forgetting. Kira. She was working as a healer in the industrial district, treating the poor and the desperate for whatever they could afford to pay. Sometimes nothing at all. Damien stood outside the converted warehouse where she lived and worked for an entire day before he found the courage to climb the stairs. He had spent 3 years imagining this moment. He had rehearsed speeches, apologies, confessions. But when he finally stood outside her door, all his carefully planned words fled. He raised his hand to knock, and stopped. What right did he have to disturb her peace? What right did he have to ask for anything? He lowered his hand. He sat down on the landing outside her door, and he waited. Part 3. The Vigil. Chapter 9. The Door. For 6 weeks he knelt at her door. Every day, at dawn, he would arrive and take a position on the landing outside her apartment, not speaking, not knocking, just waiting. A silent vigil of atonement. The warehouse landlord threatened to call the city guard. Damien bought the building. The neighbors complained about the wealthy eccentric camping on their landing. He paid them enough to make them look the other way. The local street children began leaving him scraps of food, as if he were a stray dog. He ate them. He was grateful. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, he would wake to find a bowl of broth left outside the door, still warm. She never did it when he could see her, but he knew it was her. He was a statue carved from regret. The rain fell, the city hummed its dissonant song, and Damien Blackwood, the prince who had everything, waited for a woman who had nothing to give him the one thing he now craved above all else: a chance to beg for forgiveness. On the 43rd day, the door opened. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the city's grimy skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the warehouse landing. Kira stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick, mended sweater that swallowed her frame. She held a steaming mug in her hands. For a moment, he thought she might throw it at him. He almost hoped she would. Instead, she looked at the spot on the floor beside her door, then back at him. She didn't speak a word. It was an invitation of a sort, an acknowledgement. His heart, a thing he'd thought had turned to stone, beat a painful, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. He rose stiffly, his knees aching from the cold concrete, and moved to stand beside her, leaning his back against the peeling paint of the wall. She mirrored the movement, a careful foot of space between them. They stood in silence, watching the city wake up. The mug warmed the air between them, smelling of bitter herbs and honey. It was the first time in 3 years he had been this close to her. He could see the fine, silvery scars that traced the back of her left hand, the permanent darkness under her eyes that spoke of a sleep that was never deep enough. He had put some of that darkness there. "The magistrate is dead," he said, his voice a low rasp. He hadn't meant to say it. The words just fell out of the vast, hollow space inside him. Corvus Vance, her sire. The man from the letters. "After finding you, I told my father everything." He unleashed the full investigative power of the crown. It didn't take long to uncover a lifetime of corruption. Unregistered children bought and sold, cruelty hidden behind a veneer of civic duty. He paused. And Lyra. They found Lyra. She's safe now. Free. Your father offered her reparations, a home, protection. Kira's reaction was a slow, deliberate sip from her mug. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Her expression remained as still and unreadable as a frozen lake. "I know," she said. Her voice was the same quiet, rough thing he remembered, but it held a new weight now. The weight of freedom, perhaps, or maybe just the weight of more sorrow. "Your father, the king, sent an emissary. He offered me reparations as well." She turned her head, and her gray eyes met his. "I refused the money." Of course she had. Blackwood money was blood money to her. His money. "Kira," he began, the name a prayer and a curse on his tongue. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I broke you. I am a monster." The words were a frantic, screaming mob in his head, but none of them could force their way past his lips. They were inadequate, pathetic. How could he apologize for a sin so vast? She saved him from the effort. "Why are you here, Damien?" she asked, her tone flat, devoid of curiosity. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "To apologize," he managed, the words tasting like ash. "That's not a reason," she said, turning her gaze back to the city. "That's an excuse. You're here because your guilt is heavy and you want me to help you set it down." "I won't." She took another sip of her tea. "My back is not strong enough to carry your burdens, Prince Blackwood. I am still learning how to carry my own." She finished her tea, the silence stretching between them, thick and suffocating. He thought she would go back inside, that this small, fragile truce was over. But she stayed. She stayed until the mug in her hands grew cold, and the sun was fully above the horizon, and the city below was roaring with life. They didn't speak again. But she hadn't closed the door. It was the smallest of victories, but it felt like the dawn of a new world. Chapter 10. The Lists. He continued to come. Every morning at dawn he would arrive and stand beside her on the small balcony. She would hand him a mug of her bitter herbal tea, and they would watch the sunrise over the city in silence. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. They rarely spoke. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer a battlefield or a void. It was a space they shared. One morning, 6 months into his vigil, there was a folded piece of paper tucked under a small stone on the landing. His hands trembled as he opened it. It was not a letter. It was a list. Names. 10 of them. Underneath a single sentence in her familiar, slightly shaky hand. They need medical supplies, specific tinctures for blood fade and wraith cough. The city apothecaries won't sell to them. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation. But it was a task. It was a crack in the wall of her silence. It was the first time she had ever asked him for anything. He spent the entire day hunting down the rarest of ingredients, leveraging his name and his wealth to bypass the city's prejudiced bylaws. He had the supplies delivered by a courier that evening, along with a note. Anything else? The next morning, there was another list, and the morning after that. For weeks they communicated this way, through lists of needs. Blankets, books, warding stones, winter clothes for girls who had none, medical equipment, teaching materials. He became her quartermaster, her silent, efficient supplier. He never asked to see her. He never pushed for more. He simply filled the needs she identified. He was learning a new language. Not the language of commands and demands he had been raised on, but a language of service, of quiet attention. He was learning to listen to what she didn't say. And in the space between the lists, in the careful, impersonal requests, he began to hope that she was, perhaps, teaching him how to be a man she could one day speak to. Chapter 11. The Haven. After 8 months of his silent vigil and the careful exchange of lists, Damien realized that grand gestures of destruction, like the toppling of the magistrate, meant nothing to her. Perhaps a grand gesture of creation would. He purchased the derelict textile mill across the river from her warehouse, a hulking brick behemoth with shattered windows like vacant eyes. He hired the best architects, the most compassionate counselors, the most patient teachers. He started small, basic shelter for 5 girls, hot meals, a safe place to sleep. He hired Seraphine, a kind, no-nonsense vampire with a gift for administration and an even greater gift for seeing the worth in broken things. Together, they built something that would last. The first girls arrived weary and wounded. Seraphine never mentioned Damien's name. He was a silent benefactor, a ghost in his own machine. But slowly, the haven grew. More girls came. Over 18 months, dormitories were added, then a library, then a proper clinic. He poured everything into it, his wealth, his time, his desperate, burning need to build something that could begin to balance the scales of what he had destroyed. He oversaw every detail, from the thread count of the sheets to the curriculum for self-defense and magical theory. He worked himself to the point of collapse, fueled by coffee and the hope that somewhere, across the water, she saw it. He would watch from his office window as the lights of the haven came on at night, a warm, golden constellation of hope in the city's darkness. He saw girls tending gardens on the roof, laughing in the courtyard, their shoulders slowly unhunching from the permanent defensive crouch he recognized so well. He was creating a world where Kira Vance could have been safe. He was 30 years too late. One evening, 18 months after the haven had opened its doors, he saw her standing on her small balcony, looking across the water at the building. She was just a silhouette against the twilight, but he could feel her gaze as if it were a physical touch. He didn't know what she was thinking. Was she disgusted by his hypocrisy? Did she see it as just another, more elaborate manipulation? He had no right to know. His atonement was not a transaction. He did not build the haven for her forgiveness. He built it because it was the right thing to do. The only thing he could think of to counteract the poison he had put into the world. It was an act of penance, and penance, by its nature, had to be selfless. The next morning, when he arrived for his daily vigil, there was a new list on the landing. But this one was different. The haven needs a proper healer. Seraphine does her best, but she's an administrator. The girls have wounds. Not all of them are visible. They need someone who understands. And beneath it, in smaller letters, they need me. Part 4. The Healing. Chapter 12. The Confession. 2 days later, he found her waiting for him on the landing. Not in the doorway, but sitting on the top step, her knees drawn to her chest. There was no list. He stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding a nervous, uncertain rhythm. The air was changing, growing warmer. Spring was beginning to whisper through the city's grime. The haven needs a proper healer, she said, not looking at him. She repeated what she'd written. The girls have wounds, not all of them are visible. They need someone who understands. I will hire the best in the kingdom, he said. I will pay whatever they ask. No, she said. She finally looked up at him, and her gray eyes were clear and direct. The weariness was still there, but it was joined by a flicker of something else. Purpose. They need me. He stood frozen, processing her words. She wanted to work at the Haven? The sanctuary he had built as a monument to his guilt. She wanted to make it her own. Of course, he managed to say, his voice thick. The clinic is yours. Anything you need. Staff, supplies, equipment. It's all yours. I have one condition, she said, her gaze unwavering. He braced himself. He would give her anything. His title, his fortune, his own blood. I want you to tell me why, she said. Why you hated me so much. The question was quiet, but it landed like a thunderclap. It was the one thing he didn't know how to give her. The truth was ugly, shameful. It exposed him not as a misguided prince, but as a frightened, arrogant boy. He took a breath. He owed her this. He owed her everything. He sat down on the step below her, not looking at her, but at his own hands resting on his knees. They looked like a stranger's hands. 10 years before I came to the academy, he began, his voice low. There was a rebellion, a coup attempt. It was led by my uncle, my father's younger brother, Varen. He had never spoken of this to anyone outside the immediate family. It was the Blackwoods' great shame. Varen used unregistered half-bloods, people with no records, no allegiances. They were his spies, his assassins. They infiltrated every level of the court. The woman who was my mother's closest handmaiden, who taught me how to read, she was one of them. She tried to poison my mother. My personal guard, a man I'd idolized since I was a child, he opened the gate for Varen's soldiers. He could still remember the screams, the smell of fire, the sight of his father's guards cutting down men and women he had known his entire life. He had been 15. We put down the rebellion, he continued. Varen was executed. But the fear, it never went away. My father became cautious, obsessed with security, and I learned that trust was a liability, that anyone could be a traitor, that the people who seemed the most harmless were often the most dangerous. He finally risked a glance at her. She was listening, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped around her knees. When you arrived at the academy, you were a ghost. No history, no family, a scholarship that appeared out of nowhere. You were brilliant, powerful, and silent. You were the exact image of the threat I'd been trained my whole life to see. I investigated you obsessively, hired informants, traced every record. Every investigation confirmed the magistrate's story. His documentation was perfect because he was part of the system that created it, part of the original investigation into Varen's coup. His credentials were beyond reproach. But every dead end I hit felt deliberately obscured. Because they were. He was hiding what he'd done to you. But to me, it was proof of conspiracy. Every time you refused to speak, every time you hid, it was confirmation. I saw Varen's spies in your silence. I saw the handmaiden's betrayal in your eyes. He looked away. I built a story about you in my head, and I hated you for it. I needed you to be a monster, because if you weren't, then I was. The silence that followed was vast and deep. He had laid his own ugliness at her feet, a final, wretched offering. He waited for her judgment, for the disgust, the condemnation. I see, she said, after a long time. It was all she said. She stood up, brushing the dust from her clothes. I will start at the clinic tomorrow. She went inside and closed the door, leaving him alone on the steps with the raw, open wound of his confession and the terrifying, fragile seed of her understanding. Chapter 13. Transformation. Her presence transformed the Haven. She moved into a small apartment above the clinic, and the building seemed to breathe with her. The girls, who had been wary and closed off, began to open up to her. They would seek her out, not just for remedies for their physical ailments, but for the quiet, steady comfort of her presence. She understood their silences, their flinches, the nightmares that haunted their sleep. She had lived them all. Kira created a space for healing that went beyond medicine. She started a class on runic weaving, teaching the girls to embroider their clothes with symbols of protection, just as she had done. She turned the rooftop garden into a sanctuary of herbs and medicinal plants, her hands gentle in the soil. Damien watched from a distance, giving her the space she had always craved. He still managed the haven's finances, still handled the logistics, but he never interfered with her work. He was the foundation. She was the heart. Their communication shifted from lists to brief, formal meetings in her office. She would give him reports on the girls' progress, request new equipment, discuss potential expansions to their programs. She was always professional, her voice calm, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. But sometimes he would catch her looking at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. A flicker of something in her gaze. Curiosity, maybe. An assessment. He continued to show up at her door every morning. It was a ritual he could not abandon. It was his anchor, the one constant in his new, uncertain life. He no longer waited on the landing. She would open the door, hand him a mug of her bitter herbal tea, and they would stand together on her small balcony, watching the sun rise over the haven. They rarely spoke. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer a battlefield or a void. It was a space they shared, filled with the unspoken weight of their past and the tentative possibility of a future. It was in these silences that he truly saw her. He noticed the way she unconsciously massaged her left wrist, a remnant of an old, badly healed break. He learned that she loved the smell of rain on hot pavement, that the color blue made her sad, that she hummed a strange, minor-key lullaby when she was transplanting seedlings. He was learning the language of Kira Vance, a language spoken not in words, but in small, accumulated details. He was paying attention. One morning, a year into her work at the Haven, she broke the silence. "Tell me about your mother," she said, her eyes on the horizon. He was startled by the question. He so rarely spoke of his mother. "She loved to paint," he found himself saying, the memories surfacing, dusty and bittersweet. "She filled the castle with color. After Varin, she stopped. She said she couldn't see the colors anymore. She died 2 years ago. The healer said her heart gave out. I think she was just tired of being afraid." "I'm sorry," Kira whispered. It was a simple, common courtesy, but from her, it felt like a profound gift. "My mother was human," she said, offering a piece of her own story in return. "She was a servant in the magistrate's house. She told me stories about the stars. She said every person who dies becomes a star, so they can watch over the ones they left behind. She said we're never truly alone." She looked up at the paling sky, where a single, stubborn star still lingered. "I used to look for her and Lyra up there. Now I know Lyra's alive, and I don't know where to look anymore." He saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, and a fierce, protective instinct rose in him, so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. It was not the possessive arrogance of the prince he had been, but a deep, humbling desire to shield this woman from any more pain. He wanted to reach out, to touch her arm, to offer some small comfort, but he didn't. Love, he was learning, was also about patience. It was about creating a space safe enough for someone to be vulnerable, and not demanding anything from that vulnerability. So he just stood beside her, sharing the weight of her sorrow, a silent guardian in the dawn. Chapter 14. Growing Closer. The months became years. Their morning ritual continued, the silences growing comfortable, occasionally broken by small exchanges. She told him about a particularly difficult case at the clinic. He shared a frustration with the Haven's board of directors. She laughed, actually laughed, at a dry observation he made about aristocratic politics. The sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. They began taking walks through the city at twilight, exploring the hidden gardens and forgotten courtyards Kira had discovered in her years of solitude. He learned she had a weakness for candied ginger. She learned he was surprisingly good at chess, but terrible at lying about it. He attended classes at the Haven, not as a benefactor, but as a student, learning from the girls about resilience, about survival, about the small, fierce joys that could grow in the cracks of trauma. Kira watched him sitting cross-legged on the floor one day, helping a 12-year-old with her embroidery, his face soft with concentration and patience. Something in her chest loosened. She began seeking him out, small things at first, asking his opinion on a clinic renovation, inviting him to see the rooftop garden in bloom, requesting his help moving furniture. Then larger things. She asked him to attend a difficult meeting with a girl's abusive family. She called him in the middle of the night when a patient was dying, and she needed someone to simply sit with her in the waiting room. He went every time. He never asked for more than she offered. And slowly, imperceptibly, the space between them shrank. One evening, 3 years into their redemption, after a particularly long day at the Haven, she fell asleep on the small sofa in her office. He found her there, her face smoothed of its usual watchfulness, one hand curled under her cheek like a child. He draped his coat over her shoulders and left quietly. She woke hours later, wrapped in fabric that smelled like him, cedar and old books and something uniquely Damien. She held it for a long moment before folding it carefully and setting it aside. Something had shifted, something she couldn't quite name. It was 5 years into their redemption when everything changed. They were in the rooftop garden, harvesting lavender in the golden light of late summer. The air was sweet with the scent of herbs and flowers. Their hands brushed, reaching for the same stem. It was such a small thing, an accident, but she looked at him, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and carried guilt, at the gentleness in his hands as he handled the delicate plants, at the man he'd become through patient, painful transformation. And she leaned in. The kiss was brief, tentative, a question more than an answer. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide, disbelieving. "Kira," he breathed, "you don't have to." "I know," she said. "I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm doing this because I want to." She touched his face, the same gesture she'd made all those years ago in the garden, but this time without pity, this time with something that looked remarkably like affection. "You're not the same man who hurt me, Damien, and I'm not the same woman you hurt. Maybe we can be something new together." He didn't trust himself to speak. He simply rested his forehead against hers and breathed. Chapter 15. Building a Future. The year that followed was a revelation. They were together, truly together, learning each other not as torturer and victim, not as benefactor and recipient, but as equals, as partners, as people who chose each other daily. They were careful with each other. Kira set the pace and Damien followed. Some days she wanted closeness, sought his hand during their morning tea, leaned against him as they walked through the city. Other days she needed space, and he gave it without question. He shared his own vulnerabilities with her, his nightmares about the coup, his complicated relationship with his father, his fear of becoming like his uncle, his terror that he would wake up one day and find he'd reverted to the arrogant, paranoid prince he'd been. She listened. She didn't absolve him. She didn't tell him his fears were baseless. She simply sat with him in them, the way he sat with her in hers. They discovered shared interests. Both loved ancient magical theory. Both were early risers. Both found solace in gardens and growing things. They would spend hours in the Haven's rooftop sanctuary, hands in the soil, talking about everything and nothing. The girls at the Haven noticed. They would giggle when Damien visited, whispering about the way he looked at Kira, the way she smiled more when he was near. Seraphine simply nodded knowingly and said nothing. One evening, Kira invited him to dinner in her small apartment. She cooked, badly, she admitted with a laugh, and they ate by candlelight, talking late into the night. When he moved to leave, she asked him to stay. He did, and when he woke the next morning with her curled against him, the early light streaming through the window, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. 6 years into their redemption, Damien began to prepare. He spent weeks ensuring everything was in place. He legally transferred the haven to an independent trust, removing both himself and Kira from direct control. Neither of them could manipulate it. It would stand on its own. He established a separate trust fund in Kira's name, wealth that was entirely hers that he could never touch. He wanted to ensure she could walk away from him at any moment without losing anything. Because love, he'd learned, was only real when it was free. He commissioned a ring from a craftsman in the city, simple, elegant, 2 intertwined branches in pale silver, with a single gray diamond the color of her eyes nestled in the center. It was not a prince's ring. It was a gardener's, a healer's. It was hers. Part 5. The Proposal. Chapter 16. The Question. The day he asked her to marry him, it was raining. A soft, steady spring rain that washed the city clean and filled the air with the scent of wet earth and new life. He hadn't planned to propose that day. He had come to her clinic to drop off some paperwork and found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by a group of the haven's youngest residents. She was showing them how to weave threads of light into glowing, harmless shapes, butterflies and birds and dancing sprites that flitted around the room, casting a warm, magical glow. The children were laughing, their faces full of wonder. Kira was smiling. It was a full, radiant smile, the kind that transformed her face completely, erasing the shadows and revealing the woman she was becoming, the woman she'd always deserved to be. In that moment, watching her create light in a room full of children who had only known darkness, he knew he could not live another day without asking her to be his wife. It was not a political calculation or a strategic move. It was a simple, irrefutable truth, the only thing he was more certain of than his own redemption. He waited until she was done. When the children had gone, he helped her clean up, their hands brushing as they put away the spools of thread. The small, accidental touch sent a jolt through him. He followed her to her office. She sat behind her desk and he remained standing, the paperwork clutched in his hand like a shield. "Kira," he began, his voice unsteady. She looked up, her gray eyes questioning. He put the papers down on her desk. He took a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was the ring. Simple, elegant, perfect. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he said, his voice low and raw. "I know that the man I was would have destroyed anything good between us, but I love you. I love the woman you were, who survived things that should have destroyed her. I love the woman you are, who builds and heals and creates light. I love the woman you're becoming. And I want to spend the rest of my eternal life becoming a man worthy of standing beside you. I will protect you, I will honor you, and I will spend every day earning the right to call you my wife. You can say no, Kira. You can tell me to wait, or to ask again in a year, or to never ask again. You are free. You have always been free. But if you'll have me, marry me." She stared at the ring, her face utterly still. The only sound was the rain tapping against the window pane. He held his breath, his carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter. He had braced himself for her refusal, for her anger, for her laughter. He had not braced himself for her silence. He thought, for one agonizing moment, that he had destroyed everything. that this final act of presumption had undone all the fragile trust they had built. Then she stood up. She walked around the desk until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached out, not for the ring, but for his hand. She turned it over, palm up. Her fingers, cool and gentle, traced the faint, silvery scars on his knuckles, old wounds from his years of reckless sparring at the academy. Then she lifted his hand to her cheek. She closed her eyes, and a single, perfect tear slid down her face and fell onto his skin. It was warmer than the rain. "You already wear my scars," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "And I think I have been wearing yours for a very long time." She opened her eyes, and they were shining. "I need you to understand something, Damien. I'm not saying yes because you built the Haven. I'm not saying yes because you spent 6 years atoning. I'm saying yes because when I imagine my future, you're in it. Not as penance, not as redemption, just as you." "Yes," she said. "Yes, Damien, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. And in the quiet, rain-streaked office, surrounded by the scent of herbs and healing, the prince and the ghost finally found their sanctuary. Not in a castle or a haven, but in the simple, terrifying, and miraculous space between their joined hands. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. And in the distance, across the water, the lights of the haven glowed warm against the twilight. A constellation of hope built from ashes, proof that even the most broken things could be made whole again. Epilogue. They married in the spring, in the rooftop garden of the haven, surrounded by the girls they'd both come to love. Lyra was there, hesitant, still learning how to be a sister again, but there. King Alaric presided over the ceremony, his face solemn but his eyes warm as he looked at his son. Professor Sterling attended, as did Seraphine, and a handful of nobles who had come to respect what Damien had built. But mostly it was the girls, the survivors, the ones who understood, better than anyone, what it meant to heal. Kira wore a dress of deep gray, embroidered with silver runes of protection and new beginnings. Damien wore simple black, with no royal regalia, no crown. They stood as equals before the assembled witnesses. When they spoke their vows, Kira's voice was steady. "I choose you," she said, "not because of who you were or who I was, but because of who we're becoming together." Damien's voice broke. "I will spend every day of my eternal life earning this gift," he said. "I will love you, protect you, and stand beside you. Not as your savior, not as your prince, but as your partner." They kissed as the sun set over the city, and the girls cheered. And for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt not like a burden, but like a promise. Years later, when people asked Kira about her marriage, about how she could love a man who had once hurt her so deeply, she would smile that quiet smile and say simply, "He's not that man anymore, and I'm not that girl. We built something new from the ruins." And Damien, when asked how he'd earned her forgiveness, would shake his head. "I didn't earn it," he'd say. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something you're given, if you're lucky enough, and wise enough, to receive it with humility." "What I earned," he would add, "was the right to stand beside her. And I earn it again every single day. Not through grand gestures or perfect words, but through patience, through showing up day after day, through the slow, unglamorous work of becoming better, through choosing again and again to build something good from the ruins of what was destroyed." They had been broken. Now they would heal together. And in the haven across the water, the lights continued to glow, a testament to the truth that redemption is possible, that change is real, and that even the darkest stories can find their way to the light.